Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, if the state's budget situation seems like a horror movie, well, movies, particularly the tax incentives, are becoming part of the discussion. For Tom Benson, the drama continues, and a recent parade route chase scene was all too real. We'll be looking at these stories tonight, as well as good news for the cruise business, the latest on the police consent decree, and we'll take a special look at environmental projects still on hold. In action for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Gordon Russell, the New Orleans Advocate. Bob Marshall, environmental reporter, The Lens. Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. And Gordon, you're not actually the paper, you are with the New Orleans Advocate, and happy to have you here. And we're going to talk to you first about the state's budget, which of course is really not in good shape. The governor today released what he thinks we should do. What did he have to say?
So we're facing a $1.6 billion shortfall, and the big question was how are we going to plug it? And earlier on, the governor had talked about taking a lot more money out of higher education in particular, which has been cut by more than half in terms of the state funding it gets since Jindal's been governor. I guess the big surprise today was that he reduced the cuts to higher ed substantially. They're still going to be cut, but the cuts went from, say, $400 million to closer to between $100 and $200 million. This is in his proposed budget now. It's all up for discussion. And the big change he made, he's been very resistant to cutting any tax credits or tax giveaways, things we've written a lot about at The Advocate. And he's kind of hewed very strongly to this pledge to not cut any of those because he sees that as a tax increase. This has been a matter of some contention, but there's a group called Americans for Tax Reform, very powerful national group, and they have a pledge where legislators can sign this, and legislators and politicians sign it and promise not to raise taxes in any form. And Jindal has signed it and wants to remain in the good graces of this group, in part so he can run for president. This group is seen as a pretty powerful, king-making force in that. So that was a lead-in to say, so Jindal has proposed actually paring back some of these credits to the tune of more than $500 million, which is actually a lot of money. But he cleverly or cynically, depending on your view, did it in such a way that he still remains in the good graces of Americans for Tax Reform. And the biggest way he did that was by, the biggest cut is going to come to this program called the Inventory Tax Credit Refund, which is a tax paid by businesses at the local level that the state then refunds to businesses. And because this is a local tax and not a state tax, he can take away the refund and say that he's not raising taxes because the state was never taxing these people in the first place.
Is he saying, recommending that this be permanently removed, or just adjusting it for a short, a limited period of time?
I'm not sure that that's been made clear. That's a good question. I mean, he's definitely proposing it for this year, and it could be sort of a kick the can down the road thing where we would go back to the old system next year. I think what the governor would like actually is to repeal the inventory tax altogether, which a lot of people actually think it's a bad tax. Most states don't have it.
And it's really grown a lot, hasn't
That's the
it? problem,
is that it's grown a lot. A lot of local governments really depend on it, especially in the industrial parishes. And so if you were to take it away, places like St. James Parish, St. John Parish, they would have a huge hole in their budget, and they'd have to figure out, I mean, we're talking like 30%, and they would have to figure out a way to make up that revenue.
So we should anticipate a big fight over this recommendation.
Yeah, I actually just got off the phone with Steve Wagesback, who's the head of Lobby, the state's biggest business lobby, and he thinks this is a terrible idea. And that's a very powerful lobby, which is usually, Wagesback used to work for Jindal. They're usually kind of in lockstep. But they're gonna. It sounds like they're gonna fight this tooth and nail.
So, what other tax incentives is he talking about modifying or removing altogether?
So, the inventory tax is the big one. The other next biggest one is the solar program, which was already getting phased out over a couple of years, and they're just sort of he wants to accelerate the phase out, which would mean, I don't know the timing of this exactly, but it means it would probably just sort of end the program as quickly as possible in order to realize the savings next year, and that would be save the state somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million.
What about the movie tax credit?
So that's an interesting question. That's been a very controversial credit, of course. It's gotten a lot of stories have been written about whether it's a good deal for the state, and also it's been plagued by a lot of fraud. And we've had a recent wave of news scandals. Lee Zurich from Fox 8 had a couple of stories about another series of films that looked like maybe they got way more credits than they deserved. There was a lawyer who bribed the state's top official, who recently is about to get a big check from the state. And meanwhile, no one so far has laid a finger on film, or Jindal hasn't put that in any of his proposals to change the tax credits. But there are some movements afoot by a couple of local legislators to rein it in slightly. They want to put a cap on how much it can cost and add some other kind of accountability to the program.
Well, of all those programs, isn't film the most popular with the public? We're always hearing about all the activity going on here.
I think it's hard to measure, Errol. I mean, it's certainly, I think people enjoy the attention. You know, it gets a lot of attention. There's movie stars here. You see the trucks everywhere. People kind of enjoy, I think, seeing Louisiana and New Orleans on film. And it's certainly popular among the legislators in this area. But statewide, I'm not sure it's as popular because almost all of the benefit goes to, at least half of the benefit goes to New Orleans and its suburbs, and then a little bit goes to Baton Rouge and a little bit to Shreveport, and then the rest of the state gets almost nothing from this. And of course, it's funded by the state, not the local jurisdictions.
Now, Gordon, is there any inclination among legislators to propose taxes that Jindal has shot down in the past, like cigarette tax and other measures?
Well, so Jindal, another interesting thing he did today was he offered sort of a menu of things that he wouldn't get in the way of. One of them being the raising the cigarette tax, which is something he's opposed in the past. But he sort of combined it with a credit so that he can call it revenue neutral. And he sort of laid out a menu of some choices that he thought the legislature could make, and that was one of them. But that was kind of a change because that's something he opposed in the past.
So quickly on the higher education, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob.
Well, does his budget close that hole, that gap?
I mean, on paper it does.
Paper.
That's always the question, and a couple of the other people I've talked to today think the numbers might be pretty funny. But, I mean, all the legislature is required to do is to pass a balanced budget, but it doesn't actually mean the budget balances at the end of the year. And every single year we've seen mid-year cuts because a lot of the things don't pan out. For instance, let's say we're going to sell this piece of state property and we expect to get $30 million for it, and either they don't sell it or they get a lot less money or whatever, and then you have to have some more cuts.
So 100 to 200 million still cuts to higher education. How can they make that up? Does he have any recommendation on that?
I think it's up to the schools probably. I think the schools can raise tuition and fees and things, and I think that's what they'll have to do, and maybe they'll have to make some cuts too. I mean, I think the schools are probably breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief because the cuts he's proposing are less draconian than what he had been proposing, but they are still, you know, fairly substantial cuts at the same time.
Still a lot more discussion ahead on this.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gordon. Mike, over to you. During this carnival season, we tragically had 2 shooting deaths occur. You've done some stories about that. You actually even attended the funeral of one of the victims.
Yeah, this was a rerun of a sad movie we've seen before, not just shootings and killings in New Orleans, but on the St. Charles Avenue parade route. In fact, this happened at Errol in St. Charles, where in 2004, an innocent bystander, a 20-year-old woman, was shot and killed. And here, once again on Errol, it appears that just an argument between 2 groups of young men escalated to someone pulling a gun, firing shots. 2 men were killed, Peter Dabney, 21, and Ivan Williams, who was 22. Very quickly, and about a block away, a 19-year-old high school student was arrested after police said he tossed a gun, the murder weapon, into some bushes. So John Hicks arrested and charged now with 2 counts of second-degree murder. Convictions would give him a mandatory life sentence, no parole. So in many ways you could look at it as 3 lives lost here. And the one thing that is interesting is that the parades roll on. The police response, even as Chief Harrison put it, was perfect. They were 20 officers within a couple blocks. They immediately responded, captured the alleged gunman. It appears that this was one of those types of heat-of-the-moment shootings where there was nothing that police could do.
And police were standing nearby,
right
were
there.
they not?
They're right there. literally. And similar to the 2004 fatal shooting, where arrests were made. Unfortunately, that case got very murky. One of the officers involved was in the Danziger Bridge, and that case collapsed actually. But in this case, it looks like pretty solid, with an alleged confession by Hicks, who was caught.
As you said, this occurred at Errol in St.
Right.
Charles, and that seems to have been sort of a hot spot.
Well, some of that is just bad luck of the draw, a bit coincidental. It is close to Central City, and it's where Central City is a high crime neighborhood where there is some turf battle, and those from Central City will come down to that area of St. Charles to watch the parade. But I don't think the location in particular, it certainly doesn't scare people off. The next night the parade rolls and the parade route is full. I think the general public is quite savvy that this was a beef. It could have happened anywhere at any time. It just happened to happen on a parade route with a parade rolling.
Was this a long-standing feud among these people,
Unclear.
or did it just sort of erupt?
Yeah, it is unclear whether the two different groups knew each other, had a prior beef, or just an argument erupted on the spot, while the alleged gunman allegedly confessed to the shooting, did not offer what precipitated it. But I would venture that at that age, and as police and criminologists will tell you, the impulsiveness of kids in their teens and early 20s is very high. Add a gun to the equation, off the charts, and they might not even remember what the beef was about. But what we have is 2 lives lost. Now,
2 lives lost.
The thing that goes beyond the headlines, and which I think is the more long-term and tragic story, are the victims' families. And I attended the funeral of Peter Dabney, quite sadly, the son of somebody who works at our building at WWL. And the outpouring of grief was staggering.
Yeah.
Not just standing room only, but spilling outside of the church. And those are scars that will last, for the lifetimes
they'll
of
never
the
go
people
away.
involved.
Yeah, they'll never go away. It's a tremendous loss.
We know that we have, one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country, although it's trending down. But with each of these incidents and each of these funerals, those are scars that will last generations, and that is very harmful to the psyche of New Orleans.
It certainly is, whether it happens over Mardi Gras or any time, to have such tragic loss of life.
Police can make arrests, but this sort of thing remains no matter what police policy you put into place, no matter how many people you lock up, no matter how many 19-year-olds start serving a life sentence.
Okay, we have to move on now. Thanks, Mike. Very, very tragic indeed. Our condolences to the families. Over to Bob right now, and Bob, of course, knows everything everybody needs to know about coastal restoration, which is such a major issue for the state and the country. After Katrina and Rita, a lot of projects were authorized by Congress. Are they being done?
Most of them are not being done, and most of them have been either canceled by the state, or the problem goes back to 2007 when Congress passed what's called the Water Resources Development Act. And it was a Democratic Congress, and they passed a bill that included $1.34 billion for 15 projects for the coast. President Bush vetoed that bill, but Congress overrode it. And the way these things work is you have to firstly authorize the bill, saying, okay, you can do this. But then it takes a separate act of Congress to fund it. And that usually takes a couple of years. But what happened was Congress changed hands. It was now Republican, and they didn't like spending money. So that was one roadblock. And then, a few years later, we had the BP spill. And so now you're faced with a situation where Congress that doesn't like to spend money says, you're going to get billions of dollars. Why should we give you this money? And of course, only about $1 billion of that windfall, whatever it will be, has actually come to the state's coffers to be used for these projects. The other thing that happened was many of these projects had been on the drawing board since 2000. And the science that the state's been doing on the coast, excuse me, has moved forward quite a bit. And what they discovered was, this isn't really a good idea. This isn't a wise use of money. So the story is that the state has pulled out of some of the projects. Congress has not funded any of them, even the ones that are left, and show no inclination, at least as long as the Republicans are in control, to fund these projects. So the state has been moving forward with the money it has. They got $1.3 billion from the criminal settlement and the BP spill that can only be used for diversions in Barrier Islands. The state is spending this year, I think, $700 million of its own money on these projects. But the bad news is that there has been no windfall yet from the BP spill, and the state is supposed to be spending about $1 billion a year for 50 years. So they're going to run out of money pretty soon. And on top of that, a couple of weeks ago, the president decided that the money we were expected to get from offshore in 2017, he'd like to kill that.
Yes, he would like to kill that. Of course, we do not want him to kill that. That's something, of course, the former Senator Landrieu worked very hard to make sure that we got.
Right. It was really a result of Governor Blanco and Senator Landrieu getting that thing passed in 2007.
And then what about the governor in dealing with with our serious budget situation? He made a recommendation to go fish some money out of a fund devoted to coastal restoration
That
projects.
was part of his across-the-board cuts, and he was going to take 5% out of the Coastal Trust Fund, which would have hit the budget of the CPRA, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, about, I think, around $3 million. Now, the news last night from someone involved with America's Wetland was that the governor has decided not to ask for that money. That was, I mean, all cuts are unpopular, but that one really raised a lot of hackles among a lot of his base, the governor's base.
Yeah, it's obviously a pretty small part of a $1.6 billion budget shortfall.
Well, also, it would just, the fear is it would demonstrate that really these funds are just not going to be firmly dedicated to coastal restoration.
Well, Louisiana, the Restore Act, which it deals with the fines that the oil companies will pay for violating the Clean Water Act. Louisiana has a leg up. There's a very complicated process when the money comes, how it's divided up among the states. And one of the measuring sticks is, do you have a plan? Have you demonstrated that you will use this money to do restoration work? And this state has, a much better track record than anyone. And so if the Restore Commission, which is made up of representatives from all the states, see that Louisiana is taking money that was promised for the coast, they will use that as ammunition when they argue over who gets the money.
To not give us more money. Okay, Bob, thanks. We may have to move on because we're really starting to run short on time. Let's talk about Viking Cruises a little bit. That's good news for us.
This just in, Viking ships have taken over the rivers in Europe because this company, Viking, which actually started in Europe, but it's headquartered in Los Angeles. You see the commercials on television all the time, where you see these, they've created these long, narrow boats, and they're going up and down the rivers. I mean, the old communist bloc countries, now you have tourist boats that are going down there, which I guess is probably a healthy thing. And so it's becoming a very healthy industry. It tends to attract more of an upscale tourist, a middle-aged tourist, not quite as old as like a steamboat tourist, but somebody with money, and it's a good business, and there are other competing lines now, and so it's become a very, very big thing in Europe. And the Vikings also started an ocean division, and so later this year they're going to have some smaller ocean boats that they're going to start. But they're moving into New Orleans, and are moving into the United States, and New Orleans will be their first destination. And they're creating a new type of boat, which I take is going to be different from the ones in Europe, but they're going to start in 2017. They'll go from New Orleans, and different cruises will go to different parts along the Mississippi. Also, there's another, later in March, there's a new steamboat type ship called the American Eagle that's coming into town. And so the whole river cruise part, we've had a lot of cruises going into the Gulf. Yeah. The whole river cruise part has been pretty much ignored. Now it's starting to move in a big way. And it's great welcome news, too. I hope everybody really enjoys it. It should be a fun thing to do. The one thing is that the destinations along the river, like if you're in Europe, any town that you stop in has 1,000 years worth of history. and something famous happened there, it's not necessarily the same thing with the towns along the Mississippi. Yeah. So they're going to need to kind of create some activity along the way, too.
It'll be a little bit different than cruising Europe, but still it'll be enjoyable. All right, thanks a lot, Errol. Over to Mike right now, and police consent decree. And both of you guys, we're going to have to sort of tighten up our segments a little bit because we're starting to run short of time. But I did want to talk to you about NOPD consent decree. There was a public hearing today. What we're finding out, what's the progress or not?
Well, that was a court hearing in federal court for the federal judge, Susie Morgan. And it was a classic mixed report card. At the previous and first hearing in October, NOPD scored very low on the use of body cameras and dash cams, and officers weren't wearing them and weren't turning them on. Well, now, with PIB disciplining officers who don't turn on their cameras when they're supposed to, light suspensions, 1 day on a first offense, 5 days on a second offense, but that is apparently getting the message across to officers, use your camera. And now virtually all street patrolmen are using the cameras. And that really is revolutionary and puts New Orleans far ahead of most other big city police departments.
Oh, that's progress.
Yes, it is. The poor grade came on training, where the Justice Department, present at the hearing, said that the training academy, the lessons, the policies, the instructors were dismal, just dysfunctional in every way. The police chief, Michael Harrison, responded that he has named a new commander of the academy. They've revamped the program, got a bunch of new instructors. So it looks like that's how this is going to unfold. Problems are pointed out, and with the pressure of the Justice Department and overseen by a federal judge, the police department and the city have no choice but to address the deficiencies, and that's what they're doing.
And so the requirements now, the education requirements. Chief Harrison said, let's remove the requirement for college education. What do the police monitors say about that? Are there any concerns about that?
They did not weigh in on that. That is really, that was a move pushed by the police chief, passed by the council, just to build the pipeline. They know that after 4 years of not hiring, that you just cannot wave a magic wand and hire 400 to 500 police overnight. You have to have as many applicants, because only 10% actually make it through the civil service process, the screening, the psych testing. Some lose interest, and in order to bolster that pipeline, they've agreed to drop the requirements, which were actually not there until they were added by the previous police chief, Ronald Surpass. He actually recommended not doing it. That's a bad idea. You want to raise the caliber of your recruits, but I think the basic sentiment was that we're in such dire straits that you can always add the educational, raise the educational standards at some point later when we are at full staff of the police department.
So more public hearings in the future?
Yeah, this is actually something that's a very healthy part of the process. Every few months, there's not a set timetable, but there will be a hearing of all parties involved. And believe me, a federal judge sitting high on the bench, taking all the parties to task, has some weight to bear.
Are we seeing more applicants since the education requirement has been
it's a little early,
changed?
But they claim more than 1,000 folks in various stages of the application process. It takes quite a while to go through all the screening, and frankly, because of the consent decree, this is sort of ironic. Because of the consent decree, they cannot have the size classes that they originally envisioned. Class of 50. Can't do it because it kind of dilutes the instruction. So right now they have 2 classes, one about to graduate, but both are at 29. So now they realize, wow, we really need to have these in rapid succession, simply because you can't have over 30 per class.
Okay, Mike, thanks a lot. Gordon, the latest in the Benson saga. Couple of quick updates here.
Couple of quick things. So this week, the doctors who are going to examine Tom Benson were selected. Each of the parties to the dispute got to select one doctor, and then the third doctor is to be selected by the other 2 doctors. They didn't say who these doctors are. That's not being made public at this point. I don't know if it will be down the road, but they'll each make an independent evaluation of Tom Benson and forward that to the judge, Kern Reese, for his consideration. So that's one new development. And then the other one that was, I think, last week is that Tom Benson has asked the judge in Texas who's overseeing the trustee dispute to expedite that matter, just because it's costing him a lot of money, I think, to have these temporary trustees over the overseeing this.
How much did he say it was costing him per day? Do you recall?
It was a big number, and
it was like $600 per hour for 2 lawyers, and it came to like $9,600 a day, and that's even a little bit much for Tom Benson, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even when you're a billionaire, that's not a bar bill you like picking up every day.
So he didn't get that wealthy by accident.
No, that's quite true.
The bottom line got him there.
What's the timetable then? I know the doctors will meet with Mr. Benson, and then when will there be a public report?
You know, and I'm not sure exactly if they've announced one. But have they announced the timetable, Mike?
I have not heard a timetable.
I think it's, you know, I'm sure that they've been given some direction on this, and I don't know how much of this is going to even be public, or I assume Kern Reese is just going to look at this stuff in his chambers and make some kind of recommendation. And if I were, I mean, I think it's going to have to be. I think the judge is trying to handle this very carefully, but I would be surprised. You know, I still think it's a long shot for the spurned heirs to sort of win this thing.
It remains a very high legal bar.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about this, I'm sure, in the weeks to come. Time to look ahead. Errol.
Tomorrow, the city will dedicate its first ever skateboard park. It's Paris Avenue and I-610. It's a place where it's going to be operated by a recreation department. People can bring their skateboards and non-motorized bikes and vehicles, and they're going to have ramps and all the things that you do with skateboard, but should be a fun thing.
Okay, Gordon.
It's called Parasite because it's by Paris Avenue.
Paris what?
Parasite because it's by Paris Avenue.
In less light news, we understand that there's been this Planned Parenthood clinic on Claiborne Avenue that was proposed, and they're planning to offer abortions there. It's been very controversial. It was stalled for a time in some dispute, and we understand that work has begun again there, which is going to engender protests and so forth. So you can look forward to that.
Gordon. Thank you, Gordon. Bob.
Next week, the anti-suit members of the East Bank Levy Board will vote to try to overturn the president's decision to tell the lawyers to appeal the federal judge's ruling that the suit should be thrown out.
And this is the oil and gas suit.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Bob. Thanks, Mike.
One rather sensational court case that is really barreling forward at a rapid speed is the St. Bernard Parish President, Dave Peralta, already accused of sexual battery of his wife, stalking her with emails. Well, there's a grand jury, and it looks like they're now very close to yet new charges against the sitting parish president.
All right. Thanks, guys, for being here. And thank you guys very much for joining us, too. Of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.